Fernanda, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Alice Teague. I'm Head of Biodiversity and Environmental Governance at Welsh Government. I'm really pleased to be able to welcome you to the Innovative Finance Workshop this afternoon as part of the Wales Biodiversity Partnership Conference. As I'm sure you're aware, finding new and innovative ways of financing action for biodiversity are a key theme of the Nature Recovery Action Plan for Wales, and that's the area that we're going to be exploring today. So the workshop will start with a short introductory film from Bruce Howard from Ecosystems Knowledge Network. And just to say that this was a clip that was filmed for a different conference, but it's very relevant to the workshop that we are having today, so we wanted to play it. We'll then be delighted to for Joe Pike, Chief Executive of the Scottish Wildlife Trust, to give us an overview of the Scottish £1 billion challenge model that they've developed in Scotland to address the funding gap for biodiversity and nature. Following that, we will break into individual sessions to give us all a chance to share ideas and gather evidence on the other approaches being taken in Wales and across the world, and what opportunities there are to develop future financing. So if you've attended any of these sessions previously, you'll know that questions can be asked through the live chat, and the moderators will pick those up if there are time. There's also people are also welcome to ask questions in Welsh, and these will be translated. Further details of the presentations and speakers' biographies can be found on the Hoover webpage. And I'd also like to encourage you to register for any sessions for tomorrow, the final day of the conference, and to provide feedback on the workshop later on. The sessions are being recorded and they will be available afterwards through the WBP website. So firstly, I'm going to hand over so that we can watch a short clip from Bruce Howard from Ecosystems Knowledge.
Well, thank you for inviting me to talk to you all now at your very exciting festival. Across the UK and beyond, we understand lots about the economic value of natural features upon which society depends. But why generate these values if nothing really happens in response? The natural capital accounts and environmental valuations we're now seeing highlight a need for a step change in the way the natural environment is funded. Well, this is a perfect situation for some innovation, financial innovation. And at the core of this innovation is blending finance from different sources. As we're often told, there's plenty of private capital, even in these challenging economic times. The UK has a rich tapestry of independent grant makers and philanthropists. There's also increasing pressure on government to support climate adaptation and mitigation, as well as nature restoration. Can all these different sources work together? Well, as the Ecosystems Knowledge Network, we're all about catalysing and sharing innovation in the way we steward the natural environment. Over the last few years, we've become involved in linking environment and finance through our Natural Capital Finance and Investment Conference, as well as the year-round Natural Capital Investment Forum. So here are just some examples identified through our work in this arena. Firstly, I'd like to flag environmental impact bonds. These are a type of bond where the risks and rewards are shared between the people responsible for a project and the investor. So I'd encourage you to take a look at the pioneering work of Quantified Ventures in the United States in enabling environmental impact bonds to address water quality problems in a number of cities. In Washington, Quantified Ventures served as the transaction intermediary to design and guide DC Water through the process of structuring and executing the bond. Like many cities with aging infrastructure, the District of Columbia faced regulatory and environmental concerns from its reliance on a sewage system that combined stormwater and sewage within a single system and resulted in frequent overflows into the Potomac River. Well, in 2016, the first ever environmental impact bond was privately issued to Goldman Sachs and Calvert Impact Capital, funding this pilot project to create 20 acres of green infrastructure. By that we mean permeable pavement, green roofs, and landscaped retention facilities. The returns to the investor were based on performance. Since the success of this DC bond, other bonds have taken off, and these are not just about water quality, but coastal protection too. Environmental impact bonds are innovation worth exploring in the UK. Other areas of innovative finance are just around the corner. The establishment of impact bonds that will fund habitat restoration, supporting tourism or premium food products is one example. Investment crowdfunding is another, making investment in natural features such as local green space affordable for ordinary people. There's also innovation going on in the way different organisations work together to attract blended finance. So I'd encourage you to take a look at what Greater Manchester has done through its Natural Capital Investment Plan. I'd encourage you to take a look at the Scottish Conservation Finance Project, now with a 9-point blueprint for raising £1 billion worth of investment into Scotland's natural environment. Take a look also at the Landscape Enterprise Scheme being developed by consultants 3 Keel. This is all about identifying common dependencies that groups of businesses have in a landscape and seeing if they can work together to finance the environment that they and their workforce need in order to thrive. We need to acknowledge that in the UK, the condition of the natural environment and therefore the benefits we receive from it is determined by complex patchworks of different landowners. In particular, farm businesses can play a part in taking measures that on farm that may be individually quite small, but collectively make a massive difference to water quality or flood risk. So the great work of Pembrokeshire Coastal Forum in this arena needs to be acknowledged, along with West Country Rivers Trust working with farmers and bringing them together. So trading platforms such as N-Trade also have a vital role in making these transactions between many different parties workable. One exciting development of late is the role of the reinsurance sector in supporting natural flood management. So there's a promising project in the Wyre catchment in Lancashire, supported by Triodos Bank, the Environment Agency, DEFRA, and the Esme Fairbairn Foundation, examining how it may be possible to finance natural flood management. In nearly all of the examples I've given, water companies are involved. That's great to see. So I commend this arena of natural capital finance to you. The UK is a leader in the greening of the financial services. But the question now is, will it be a leader in financing the green, the natural environment that we all depend on? Thank you.
So that was a short clip from Bruce Howard. Obviously, Bruce isn't here to take questions, but if you do have any thoughts on anything that you've heard, please feel free to drop them into the chat bar and we will make a note of them. I'm delighted to hand over now to Joe Pike, Chief Executive of the Scottish Wildlife Trust, who will take us through the £1 billion challenge model, which Bruce mentioned in his video. So over to you, please, Joe.
Thank you very much, Alice. I hope everybody can hear me. Thank you for the invitation to speak today at this important conference, which is very timely. We're part of the Wildlife Trusts movement, so the Scottish Wildlife Trust is a charity as part of a bigger family, including the Wildlife Trust Wales, who I know are working on a lot of things here that are very relevant to these discussions. So the £1 billion challenge arose from a 2-year project which I think we can probably summarise in the image that I hope you can see on the screen now, which is really about a chasm of incomprehension and scale between the environmental community and the finance community. Now, this won't be news to most of you. We understand that there's lots of jargon. I don't come from a finance background, but I do see that there's a huge amount of movement in this area, which will bring these issues into the mainstream in the next couple of years. And I think one of the biggest challenges for us all is helping to demystify a lot of the terms and the concepts involved. Now, Bruce Howard, in his excellent opening video there, touched on a lot of the things that arose during the 2-year project, which was the Scottish Conservation Finance Project. Now, this set of slides represents the whole publication, which I'm not going to talk through in detail. You'll be able to find it online. The project itself was led by the Scottish Environment Protection Agency and the Scottish Wildlife Trust, but it was much, much broader than that and brought together a coalition of different stakeholders. We prioritised those who we felt had an interest in seeing this project succeed. We partnered with the Scottish Forum on Natural Capital, whose innovative finance group became the expert finance group for this project, and in so doing doubled in size, and brought together a lot of different perspectives. So what I want to show you in this document, you'll see here, by the way, that we set out the journey of that 2-year project for anybody who's interested in it. And we've got to base camp just now. That's the crucial thing to point out. We're not at the summit yet. But what we set out to do here is provide some pathways to novel finance for biodiversity that would show a variety of ways in which this money can come in. And I'm going to make 3 important points, I think, before I just delve into a couple of examples within the publication. The first thing to say is that not all money is the same. And the reason that I say this is a lot of people have asked us whether everything in this route map to £1 billion involves a return to investors. And time and again we hear that there is plenty of money in the private financial markets, and there absolutely is, and there's increasing interest from investors in financing things to do with the Sustainable Development Goals. However, conservation finance, or finance for nature, is definitely broader than that. So the first thing is that not all money is going to deliver a return to private investors. For example, what we see, broadly speaking, is the opportunities in conservation finance tend to fall into the category of investment products, but also innovative loans and innovative levies. And we'll come on to loans specifically in a minute. But also, it's important to understand the difference between upfront capital that comes in to enable you to do the things that will restore ecosystems, and the cash flows that will come in over a very different time frame, over a long-term period, that themselves can provide vital finance, or that can be packaged up as cash flows that will repay investors. So what we did here is the 9 opportunities that Bruce very kindly mentioned in his video have all been categorised. You'll see in the top right whether it's at concept stage or active development or ready to go, and you'll also see some icons indicating which of the Sustainable Development Goals these opportunities deliver. But the second point that I want to make, alongside the fact that not all money is the same, and it's really important that we think as broadly as we can about money and its role, is that we're talking here about system change, and transformative system change at that. So I was at a really excellent event last year at which somebody from the United Nations Development Programme made some very powerful points about transformative change. So one being that transformative change is very receptive to signals, that signals themselves can have a disproportionately important effect on the direction of travel, and secondly, that transformative change is definitely not linear. So I think in thinking about systems change and linking that to my previous point about not all money being the same, it's really important that we put these investment opportunities in the context of the other money that we have to use well. So we know across the world, for example, there's an increasing amount of attention being paid, quite rightly, to damaging subsidies. now more than ever, when government, the public purse is coming under increasing pressure, particularly in an economic crisis that we currently face due to the pandemic, we can't have wastage in the system, and we can't have things in the system that are fighting against each other. We need that policy coherence. We need to look to the future of different kinds of agricultural and land management subsidies, for example. So the third point brings me nicely to this first example, which is that really nobody and no individual sector has all of the answers. So we brought together a range of stakeholders to look at 9 deliberately really different kinds of model, and some of them were already concepts that existed prior to the commencement of the £1 billion challenge. Others arose from the £1 billion challenge as forms of innovation that would not have happened otherwise, and others are really a chance to enhance and showcase things that are happening already. Now, the Natural Capital Pioneer Fund is an idea that was proposed by an organisation called Conservation Capital. Some of you will know Neil Burney, who is based in Scotland and has done this kind of thing elsewhere in the world, but never on our own soil. Neil's attracted a lot of attention in the Financial Times and elsewhere for doing some very pioneering finance for nature work. The idea behind this is that it's a range of actors who are going to need to deliver these benefits for biodiversity. So it's not just nature conservation charities like the Scottish Wildlife Trust, it's not just government agencies. In some cases, it will be businesses themselves who are actively doing things to benefit biodiversity. Now, it's important to realise that because we're talking about system change, then restoration of ecosystems is paramount and absolutely crucial, but we also have to address the pressures on biodiversity, and we have to do things to reduce those as well. So the Natural Capital Pioneer Fund, it's not launched, or it's probably worth just really emphasising, this is not a fundraising campaign to raise £1 billion. This is about pointing the pathways to potential sources of finance. So this one, as you can see in the top right hand corner, is ready to go. That means that the model is fully developed, but it's not operational and live yet. So the idea being, this is a rotating fund. It targets businesses that don't, for various reasons, have access to mainstream finance, therefore supporting innovation, but it's targeting businesses that might be startups, but might already be very established larger businesses that want to reorient themselves towards things that will benefit biodiversity. So in a Scottish context, that could be sustainable agriculture related, it could be sustainable tourism, it could be a whole range of things. Sustainable aquaculture also comes to mind. Salmon industry is very important in Scotland, but it has huge negative environmental impacts. If a company can innovate in a way that greatly reduces the environmental pressure in certain sectors, then that's the kind of thing that we can also look at financing through something like the Natural Capital Pioneer Fund. So the other 2 examples that I'm just going to pick out from this document are the Nature Climate Bond and another one about invasive non-native species loans. Now, the Nature Climate Bond is an example of what Bruce also highlighted in his video, crowdsourced investment. So we've been working with a company called Abundance Investment. They provide a platform to enable ordinary investors like you and I to invest money from as little as £5 in projects that they believe in. It's not a donation, there is a return on that money, but what distinguishes this from a tradable regulated green bond that might be issued by a government, for example, is that it's cheaper, and because it's not regulated, it's a little bit less cumbersome and therefore simpler. So these are municipal bonds, they're bonds delivered with local authorities, but so far the bonds that have been issued by Abundance Investment in partnership with local authorities have all focused on what we would probably now all think of as the mainstream climate change interventions in terms of low carbon technology and so on. This is about bringing nature into the picture, and crucially it's about thinking holistically and cross-subsidising some of the elements that will not necessarily deliver immediate savings or will not be as monetisable, but doing that from day one so that we're not just simply kicking the can down the road, trying to reach our net zero targets with all of the easy wins and then suddenly finding out that our options have run out. So Edinburgh City Council is really excited about this. Their head of finance is very excited about this. This would be about bringing money into the local authority and, crucially, engaging local citizens in that process. And the final example I'm going to give you from the 9 that appear in this document is this one. Now, this one is one of my favourites because I think it represents a huge area of potential. And it was sparked by a conversation that we had with a member of the Innovative Finance Group who said, look, actually, lots of these conversations remind me of conversations 15 years ago in climate finance, where things that are now obvious to us all were not obvious to us then, but became transformative. And the specific example that he gave was loans to enable institutions to purchase low energy heating systems and repay those loans out of the savings, which then would materialise in the coming years. So we spent a long time thinking about how this would best translate into conservation finance. And as you know, avoided costs are a major theme in reducing flood damage, in improving water quality and all sorts of things. But we decided that actually there's an enormous opportunity here. And we talked to Lloyds Bank about this. They have a large clean growth fund, I think it's called, and it's £2 or £3 billion, but they've never incorporated something like this into it. Again, it's the more mainstream climate change interventions. So what we believe here is a real opportunity to start tackling the problem of invasive non-native species, which the science tells us really requires a shift, a major transformational shift from constant eradication and management to prevention. That's what we need, but also tackles the underlying costs, the huge costs that we are incurring year on year on year in not really getting to grips with this. So there are all sorts of logistical complications in terms of putting something like this in place. But if you read the content in the document, what you'll see is it's exactly the same principle as those low energy heating systems. If you can utilise a large amount of upfront capital to direct that towards the prevention of invasive non-native species, and it's more complicated because you'll probably need to engage lots of stakeholders on the ground to deliver that work. Nevertheless, that will yield savings and deliver benefits for biodiversity over time. So very happy to sort of take any brief questions, or please do drop me an email at the Scottish Wildlife Trust if there's anything you want to follow up afterwards. But thank you very much for having me here today, and I hope that will spark some further conversations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jo. That was a really useful and interesting overview of the £1 billion challenge model, and certainly lots of food for thought about how we can develop similar innovative products here in Wales, and also the process to go through. There are a few questions in the chat function if you have a couple of minutes to take them. Okay, so there's one from Liz Hancock. How would somebody make money on the nature climate bond? Is it basically a loan to a local authority who would then pay interest on loan payments, and that forms the return on interest?
So basically what would happen is the local authority would issue the bond, which is a form of debt, so it's like a promissory note. So they would issue that to their local citizens would invest in that, and then over time, the savings or the additional income that is generated by the interventions funded by that upfront capital from those citizens would enable the local authority to pay that back with interest. So the key actor to convince here is the local authority. They've got to believe that this is going to do enough to generate income from a renewable energy project that's combined with a green space that is going to be made more biodiverse, that surface water runoff costs are going to be reduced, for example. Essentially, it's debt issued by the local authority.
Thank you, Jo. That was really helpful. We've got a further question from Sarah, who said, you mentioned that transformative change was open to signals. Could you expand on the type of signals you mean?
I think that what we're seeing at the moment in this current pandemic is a lot of people suddenly turning to face in the same direction, and we don't necessarily have the action in place yet to truly bring nature into the green economy. However, we need to make the green economy greener, and what we see is signals that investors are interested, businesses are interested, the general public has finally started to realise there is a link between even the current pandemic that we're in and the destruction of nature. So I think some of those things are social signals. I think some of them are probably more to do with innovations that are happening in sort of tiny ways that can then potentially be scaled up much faster than we might expect.
Thank you, Joe. Just sorry, my eyesight is appalling. I'm trying to read the text. So we've got a question from Rachel Sharp. Phil, we have the potential of gaining interest and investment in Wales. However, we need to address the governance structures to instigate the right conversations. Any advice on setting up the right input and advice?
I think this is a massively important question, actually. So what we've done since we published the route map back in May is we've created a forum for people who are already engaged in the project and people who've become interested in it since, to start having open conversations. And we've just used Basecamp, which is, lots of you will be familiar with, is free, and it's an online place for people to gather. So I think there are about 70 or 80 individuals feeding into that conversation at the moment. And as I said at the beginning, I think we really are only at Basecamp at the moment, but the governance stages of the discussion are quite crucial in terms of what comes next. And there'll be different governance models required for different aspects of it. I think that's important to say as well.
Thank you, Joe. And I know that you need to dash off, so if I may take the liberty of asking.
I can stay and enjoy the rest of the conversations in this workshop if you want me to. So I'm flexible.
Oh, excellent. Okay, well, I'm going to take the liberty of a question, and while I'm asking a question, if anybody else has anything they'd like to ask Joe, please put it into the chat function, because we will break into breakout sessions shortly. So, Joe, we are, at Wales, looking at what we can do as part of the Nature Recovery Action Plan to attract and develop innovative funding models. What would you say has been the main lessons learned from what you've done so far?
That's a really good question. I think one of the main lessons is that we all need to find the most effective ways of thinking in the short, medium and long term. So Wales is a good example of a nation that is thinking to the future, with the Future Generations Commissioner and so on, and the idea that we're looking to 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals. I would say thinking long term is probably one of the biggest challenges we all still need to work on.
Thank you. That's really helpful, and I agree. I mean, when you're trying to think long term, it's as a civil servant, obviously you tend to think in electoral cycles, but the transformative action that we need to see for biodiversity obviously doesn't follow those patterns, and to see the results that we want to see, we must need to look long term.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think of it like a giant boulder that takes a lot of momentum to start moving, but once it starts, then it will gather speed. I think the other thing is that in everything we look at, from reports that are published and conversations that we have with partners in the UK and beyond, internationally as well, the role of government always comes up as being really crucial, actually. So I think governments sometimes feel that they don't necessarily have an important role because the private sector is where the innovation is going to happen. But I would say that's definitely not the case. It requires everybody to be part of the solution across all sectors.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I am going to take the liberty of just one more question, and then we will go into the breakout sessions. But the role of government, could you expand on what role Scottish government played in the £1 billion challenge model?
So it's probably more about the role that government wants to sort of define for itself at the next stage, but specifically during the creation of the route map. We had the Scottish Government through its agencies, and also Gary Gillespie, who's the Chief Economic Advisor to the Scottish Government, has been very engaged in these kind of discussions. So we've seen, obviously, SEPA, the Scottish Environment Protection Agency, was one of the two lead partners. So I think that's a good example of the public sector coming together with the third sector. Nature Scot, which is the new name for Scottish Natural Heritage, they're even more engaged. They were engaged in the leadership group at the time, but even more so now. I think realistically, we need to create an enabling environment for some of these things to start coming to fruition. And that's partly about policy coherence, making sure that things aren't fighting against each other and thinking about subsidies and all sorts. It's partly about upskilling and looking at the networks that already exist, where perhaps new information can be fed into those business advisory networks and so on. But it's also about some kind of seed funding. I think realistically, going back to Neil Burney's example of the Natural Capital Pioneer Fund, in his experience, that will become self-sustaining, but only when it's at the size of about £25 million. And at the very beginning, you can't go from a standing start to everything functioning at that level. So it's just sort of understanding that upfront help will unlock future potential. And those are all the conversations that are very live at the moment in Scotland.
Thank you so much. A lot of lessons to be learned for us in Wales as we're thinking about these things. And thank you for taking the time out of your busy agenda today to come and share the model with us and the work that you've done in this area so far. Thank you.
No, thanks very much, Alice. And as I say, if anybody has any further questions, they can always drop me a line at the Scottish Wildlife Trust.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Jo. So now we're going to be separated out into breakout sessions. There are a number of questions that we will consider, and then we will come back briefly to plenary for a few minutes before we finish at 5.
Okay, everyone, send you to breakout rooms now. Okay, Caryn, you're good to go? Everything looks okay?
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Okay.
So I have my participant list here, and I'm very lucky because I seem to. Oh, I thought I was going to have Jo there for a minute. So you should. I have got Jo. Oh, I'm very lucky. I think.
I'm happy to stay, Caryn. My schedule's changed a little bit, so just tell me if you'd like me to stay or not.
We'd be delighted if you would stay. Yes, thanks, Jo. Particularly as I'm probably the least well qualified person on this group of facilitators. So those of you who have joined this group, you are very welcome to put on your cameras. You should now have a little bar at the top of your screen, so you can put on your camera, which is the little headshot person. You can put on your mic. You should already be able to hear. So if you're in the room, it'd be lovely to see you or to hear you, or you can just continue to type in the chat box if you prefer. So I don't know if you would like to say hello. That would be brilliant. I've got Alison H, Andrew Tuddenham, Chloe, Gillian, and Sarah. So if you'd all like to say hello, that would be great. Can you hear me? Are you there?
Hiya, it's Chloe here.
Hiya, Chloe. It's a bit unnerving. I was thinking there was nobody there for a minute. Hi, Alison. Okay, great. Well, feel free to put on cameras and microphones as you like, and we can chat. But as you can see, we've got a few questions here to think about. I will type into the boxes if you speak, but otherwise feel free to add some text. But the first question is about the examples of projects levering in private finance using innovative mechanisms that we're already aware of in Wales. So I think a couple of them were mentioned in our presentations. But as I said, I'm probably the least qualified person to talk about these, and I'm being a willing facilitator. So please do jump in with any examples that you're familiar with. I can also add text if anybody wants to provide any information. If not, and you're all very quiet, I can move on to the second question. If there's anything that anybody wants to volunteer about other models and approaches from other countries, policy areas. Obviously, we've had a lot of information from Joe, so we know about those.
There's an interesting, nice example, Caryn, from the States called the Forest Resilience Bond, and it's all based on the idea of reducing the cost of forest fires. So I think it's the kind of model that could very easily translate into a flood prevention model. That's definitely worth people Googling if they're interested.
Okay, I'll catch that. And the other, there was one mentioned in the discussion about the Pembrokeshire Coastal Forum. So I presume the forum itself is not the example. There must be something. Is that one you're familiar with, Joan?
I'm not actually.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we
Hello,
can.
it's Andrew Tuddenham here. Yeah, I think that I missed that reference in the presentation. It might be that the Coastal Forum have been involved for a few years now in a project called BRICS, which is Building Resilience in Catchments. So that's exploring its way towards a payment for ecosystem services model based on developers and industry around the Cleddau catchments putting into a fund which will pay for sustainable land management. The overall aim being about balancing nutrient inputs into that waterway. So farming is one source of nitrate, development housing is another source, and there may be ways of maintaining a stable level and then eventually reducing the level by getting into that mechanism where the two are tied together, and there's funding coming in from the commercial end of things with the development, which pays for ways to reduce inputs from the land. So I don't think it's running, but it's been working its way with lots of scoping and development of the model.
Okay. Sounds interesting. I'm sure my colleagues know more about that. I know Gareth has been working on the Gareth Davis, who's facilitating another one, works on the Sustainable Management Scheme, which I think is where the funding for that scheme comes from. Yeah. Okay. Good to hear it being quoted though. Perhaps then, if people on the call are more interested in sort of learning about or thinking about how we could apply this, maybe this is the sort of oh, thank you very much, Sarah. That's interesting. Is that something you're aware of there, Joe? Blended finance.
Is that in the chat? I
Yes.
can't quite see.
You scroll down the page a bit. 60+ global case studies on their website of blended finance. Lots of different models.
No, I haven't. I can't actually see that question either. But no, I'm not familiar with that. But I mean, there's a huge amount of stuff being published virtually by the week at the moment. So that sounds really interesting. I'll certainly have a look.
Yeah, thanks very much, Sarah. Oh, hello.
Sorry, it's Chloe here. I didn't want to interrupt there, but another thing that I learned about yesterday was the Blue Impact Fund. I think it was literally just released a couple of days ago, but it's with Finance Earth and WWF, and it's about investing in the marine environment. So I think it's targeting enterprises to produce sustainable seafood, and then people invest in that and then get money, get attractive returns. I don't know a lot of information about it, but it's quite new, but I thought that might be worth mentioning.
Blue Impact Fund. Yeah, okay. Thank you for that. Just to say that we will capture the chats here as well, so I won't necessarily type everything up that you say. Sorry, Joe, were you going to come in?
No, I was just going to say, in terms of other things that are brand new, there's a report that I think may have even come out today, which I think RSPB and the National Trust are behind, and that's specifically about financing nature in the UK. So I haven't actually read it yet. I've skimmed through, and it looks like it's got lots of good content. Another place to look for some really good case studies and up-to-date information is the Conservation Finance Alliance. So if you Google the Conservation Finance Alliance, there's a network of conservation finance professionals and international developments that are definitely worth looking at.
Okay, so it sounds like there are many, many examples out there of lots of things being done. I wonder if perhaps we could just look at the next question then, which is, what are the barriers to us actually using these? What is holding us back from charging ahead with these mechanisms? I can tell you what it is for mine. I find it all very confusing. So how does it work? It's I'm sure for those of us who've been working in the sort of conservation arena for many years, when you had your funding and you got on with your project, then this is all quite new and scary, and how you actually make these work. And I think that's sort of part of the of what we really need to learn more and find out more about.
Definitely.
Yeah, I agree, and also I think when you look at the sort of conventional model of, say, the avoided costs of water treatment, so that sort of payment for ecosystem services model, that one of the big barriers that we hear a lot from the water companies is just making sure that the regulatory floor, so-called regulatory floor, is effective and applied, because then otherwise your investment is at risk. If they're paying in to a fund to achieve better standards of land management and regulation, could be delivering some of that. That's a bit of a waste of money, and obviously there's risk of breaches that aren't being picked up and properly enforced. So that's one thing. I think I'd add as a reflection as well that again, within the context of land, there needs to be, I think, a means more of an uptake of farmers banding together and forming collaborative groups who will be more powerful in brokering some sort of deal and at scale, so across a landscape. I think individual farmers are going to be quite disadvantaged in trying to get into these sorts of markets to sell their services.
Let me see if I'm understanding that correctly. So the barrier is the need for these groups to set up as a sort of business opportunity.
Yeah, I think so, and I think they could, negotiate a better deal if industry needs some sort of service from land, for example, that they can provide. It's going to be better negotiated and delivered at scale as well. If it were done through some sort of model whereby there's a group of land managers working together, and that's not always easy.
I really agree with that, actually, and I think sometimes intermediary bodies will need to be put in place in order to bridge that gap between small individual landowners and private investors. I mean, certainly it's not worth the due diligence costs to private investors of investing small amounts of money, but equally for individual landowners, they can't offer something that's of the scale that would be of interest to mobilise private capital.
Yeah, so there's something in there about brokering, about getting, like you say, an intermediary to help set these things up.
So if we're looking at enablers, then brokering is a key point. So, Joe, who provides brokering in Scotland?
So we've got a project called Riverwoods, which is about a year and a half into the early development stages with a group of stakeholders, and we're trying to design conservation finance principles into this project from day one, really. So we're not just sort of launching straight into the delivery of riparian restoration. It's a vision, a Scotland-wide vision for healthy riparian habitats and river systems across the whole of Scotland. So that means that the land ownership is complex and very varied. There's loads of examples of good things happening already, but nothing to join those up, nothing to help people gain access to finance. So that's exactly the kind of thing that we're exploring with those stakeholders. How do we give people better access to the information, the best practice, the finance itself, profile for what they're already doing, those kinds of things.
Mm.
And I think one of the reasons that blended finance is so important actually is that there are aspects of this where we do need to think about the ethical questions around returns to investors, and in some cases, because what we're talking about is very new, the level of risk is quite high, and if the level of risk is quite high, obviously investors expect a higher return to compensate for that higher level of risk, and we might find collectively that as a society that return is unacceptably high, and we don't want to be paying that much back to private investors, which is where then obviously blended finance can help to reduce some of those risks by blending in philanthropic support, government support, and so on, so that you actually sort of bring it into the realms of the manageable.
Okay, so this is where you start to lose me when you start to talk about the risk and returns and all sorts of things. But
just at a really simple level, you know, there are investors that want to put money into products that will align with the Sustainable Development Goals, partly because they believe that that's a good thing, but also because all of the indicators, or a growing number of indicators, are pointing towards sustainable business being a proxy for good business. So in other words, they want to invest in, you know, businesses that will be surviving and thriving long term. So if they've got that initial interest, it then comes down to, well, if I'm investing in a whole load of things, if I invest in lots of high risk things, some of those things will fail. So to make up for that, I'm going to have to demand quite a high return. Whereas if there's something that's safe as houses, tried and tested, you're really, really confident, then actually you might be willing to accept a lower return because it's a sure thing, and so you kind of can't lose if you've got the money to invest. Government bonds are probably a good example of a low risk investment, because at the end of the day, it's the government that takes the risk. If a government lends you money by issuing a bond, sorry, if you lend government money by purchasing a bond, then you will probably trust that you'll get the money back simply because you've got the bit of paper that says the government will pay you back and the government's not going to disappear. So things like that.
Thank you. Thanks for my finance for dummies. I just want to pick up on Sarah's got a couple of comments, and we're going to get pulled back in a minute. So Sarah, are you involved? You've got lots of really interesting points to make there. So I just wanted to ask you very quickly, what do you think would be the key thing that would help us to move this on? Oh, 30 seconds. If we lose you and you could type that into the main box, that's fine, Sarah, don't worry about your mic. But if when we get back in to the main one, you could just type what you think the key thing that you would need to help you to move this on, that would be really helpful. And I am meant to report back on the key information we've got.
Thank you. You're back.
Back in the main room.
Brilliant. I think I was mid-flow, so apologies to my breakout group. Thank you all. I hope you had a productive breakout sessions and sort of lots of conversation. We certainly had some interesting discussions in mine. I'll ask Caryn and Gareth just to very quickly summarise any sort of three key sort of takeaways from their sessions before I draw this workshop to a close. So Caryn, what would you say were the three takeaways from yours?
I think so. We had quite a lot of examples from overseas, and a particularly good pointer to a register of 60 global examples. So that was very useful. In addition, we talked about the barriers then, and lots of that is about scale and the fact that we need brokering in order to bring lots of projects and put registers together so that people can, that there's really key investable opportunities there. And then we were just talking about the enablers at the end. And I was certainly saying from my point of view, it's very much about the fear factor. It's very much sort of about how on earth do you make this work? And Joe very kindly gave me a kind of finance for dummies rundown in terms of risk and return. So that was very helpful. But in terms of the key ask from the group, I don't know, I would really encourage people in my group to add in there what they think would be the really key thing that would help us to move on and take this on to the next step. I think we did identify quite a lot of barriers, so it was which I've captured.
Great, thank you, Caryn. Gareth?
It was established there's lots of models out there for innovative finance, but it was felt that the blended finance approach was probably the one that we should be focusing on and was at the forefront. As far as key messages, it was felt that Welsh Government needed to take or show leadership and around governance, and to create a roadmap for setting out the goals and objectives as we move forward, and that seed funding from Welsh Government in order to kickstart projects, pilots and case studies should be at the forefront of that too.
Lovely, thank you. So a very clear role for Welsh Government to play in this area going forward. And so from my group, we discussed a number of areas. An interesting one on the differences between the policies and the practices in England and Wales, with a specific focus we talked around the biodiversity net gain. We talked about the challenges around valuing biodiversity, and a local authority talked about land that is, sort of often seen as capital to be sold off rather than maybe having sort of intrinsic value in and of itself. We learnt about a specific initiative called the Quartile Initiative, which brings together private finance through food retailers and suppliers with a particular focus on environmental benefits. And we also talked around, knowledge and knowledge and awareness. Really, more is needed in this area, and particularly the language that we use when we're talking to or trying to attract finance. So Caryn, I'd be very interested in your sort of dummies talk on risk and so on, because certainly, for my benefit, that would certainly be needed. I mean, unless there are any last questions in the chat function, I'm just having a quick look.
Looks like Andrew and Rachel are typing, but
I mean, it's just as say thank you all for joining the workshop today, and particularly for Joe for giving us the overview, and to Bruce for providing the clip. The main takeaway from me is that there's a lot of interest in this area, that we need to look at how we expand the conversation that we're having, so it's with other organisations, that we're using the right language, that we are on this journey, and there's an interest and a willingness to do this. A particular role for Welsh Government around governance and seed funding, and Andrew is saying about establishing the financial value of environmental public goods for those that currently have none. Yeah, it's a very good point. And yes, the proposed sustainable farming scheme will have a role in this. Just to say again, please, we will capture the comments from this. We want to carry on this conversation, so please get in touch with us or the Wales Biodiversity Partnership with any ideas and thoughts you have, or any models, products that you're aware of that would be useful for us to take forward. Just really, finally to sort of draw this to a close. Again, to thank the speakers, to thank you all for attending. I know, sort of 4 to 5 slots is not always the sort of the most favoured time of day. So it was, it was good to have you here with us and for the discussion. Just to remind you that tomorrow is the final day of the conference, and you can find more information on the sessions that are happening online. And if you can provide us with any feedback on the sessions via the rate session button on the Hoover agenda in each session, please do. And sort of particularly on any sessions that you would find useful in the future.